Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. Well, on behalf of the Harvard Initiative for Learning and Teaching, HILT, and the Harvard Writers at Work lecture series, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to today's event. My name is Sam Moulton, and I'm HILT's Director of Educational Research and Assessment. We have two exceptional speakers today, Steve Pinker and Jill Abramson, who need little introduction. Both are extraordinarily impactful public intellectuals who shape our national dialogue, accrue accolades from every corner, and inspire minor feelings of inadequacy in some of us. One of today's speaker, I won't say who, is a member of the luxuriant flowing hair club for scientists. It's true. And the other has a crimson H tattooed on her back. Steve's most recent book, The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, is the motivation for today's event on mastering style, the learning and teaching of writing. Of all the topics within learning and teaching, of all the challenges and opportunities facing colleges and universities in this moment of disruption and innovation, why writing? Why not talk today about MOOCification or modularization, flipped classrooms, or active learning? Well, I think one reason is that writing is a, if not the, core competency that transcends our diverse landscape of departments, programs, and curricula. Whether we are lawyers, doctors, artists, educators, scientists, humanists, public health professionals, policy experts, theologians, or just intellectually curious, we are all readers and we are all writers. Writing is not only a shared curricular goal or educational value, it is also a shared personal experience. None of us were born expert writers, and each of us has experienced transformative moments in our own evolution as writers. As a sophomore in Harvard College, I was forced in a tutorial to write exclusively in the active voice, which was terrifying at the time. And my graduate advisor here, Steve Koslin, offered me years' worth of writing apprenticeship that changed how I write. Because each of us can reflect on our own writing education, writing represents a natural case study for discussing pedagogy more generally. So how might we seize upon this common ground to discuss the cultivation of any academic expertise? Finally, writing is an especially relevant topic within education because it is not just a common academic pursuit or educational experience, but also a foundational form of instruction. When we write, at least in the sort of classic prose that Steve advocates for and Jill advances in her journalism, we convey facts, ideas, arguments, stories, perspectives, truth. And in that aspiration, writing is teaching, and maybe not that different from a traditional lecture or an online video. So, a note on the format of today's event. Steve will share his insights for about 20 minutes. Jill will offer some brief commentary. I will ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions from any of you. So, why don't we welcome Steve and Jill onto the stage.
Thank you very much. Why is so much writing so bad? And how can we make it better? Why do we have to suffer through legalese, as in the revocation by these regulations of a provision previously revoked subject to savings does not affect the continued operations? Why do we have to endure so much academies, as in it is the moment of non-construction, disclosing the absentation of actuality from the concept, in part through its invitation to emphasize in reading the helplessness of its fall into conceptuality? Why is it so hard to set the time on a digital alarm clock? There's no shortage of theories, and perhaps the most popular one is captured in this cartoon, in which the boss says to the tech writer, "Good start, needs more gibberish." In other words, bad writing is a deliberate choice. Bureaucrats insist on gibberish to evade responsibility. It's the revenge of the nerds. Pasty-faced tech writers get their revenge on the girls who turned them down for dates in high school and the jocks who kicked sand in their faces. Pseudo-intellectuals try to bamboozle their readers with highfalutin gobbledygook, disguising the fact that they have nothing to say. Well, I have no doubt that the bamboozlement theory is true of some writers some of the time, but as a general explanation, it doesn't ring true. Because good writers, good people, can write bad prose. I know many scholars and scientists who do groundbreaking work on important topics. They have nothing to hide and no need to impress, but still, their writing stinks. The second popular theory is digital media are ruining the language. Google is making us stupid. The digital age has produced the dumbest generation, which jeopardizes our future. Twitter is forcing us to think in 140 characters. Now, there is an implication of the dumbest generation theory, and those of you who were around before the digital age can help collectively test it. That is, before the digital age, like in the 1980s, things must have been very different. And those of you who were around in the 1980s surely remember that that was the age in which teenagers spoke in articulate paragraphs, in which bureaucrats wrote in plain English, and in which every academic article was a masterpiece in the art of the essay. Or was it the 70s? The truth is that bad prose has burdened readers in every generation, as in 1961, in which a commentator lamented that recent graduates, including those with university degrees, seem to have no mastery of the language at all. Well, what about before the age of radio and television, like in 1917, when a commentator noted, "From every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate, every high school is in disrepair because its pupils are so ignorant of the merest rudiments." Well, maybe you have to go back even further to the age of enlightenment, such as 1785. Our language is degenerating very fast. I begin to fear that it will be impossible to check it. And then there are the ancient grammar police who said, "Oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a little bird." I think a better theory comes from an observation by Charles Darwin that man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, whereas no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. That is, whereas speech is instinctive, writing is and always has been hard. The reader is unknowable, is unknown, invisible, inscrutable. The reader exists only in the writer's imagination. They can't react or break in or ask for clarification. So writing is an act of pretense, and writing is an act of craftsmanship. So what can we do to improve the craft of writing? Well, in the sense of style, I've suggested that we bring to bear the science and scholarship of language. Modern grammatical theory, which provides more insightful analyses of English constructions than the old grammars that were ported over from Latin. Evidence-based dictionaries. Research from cognitive science on what makes sentences easy or hard to read. And historical and critical studies of usage. And I'll give you just two samples from the ways in which I think these bodies of scholarship can improve the craft of writing. The first is the starting point, that is a model of effective prose communication. Since writing is an unnatural act, good style requires a coherent mental model of the communication scenario. How the writer imagines the absent reader, and what the writer is trying to accomplish. And my favorite characterization of an ideal model of communication comes from a wonderful little book called Clear and Simple as the Truth by the literary scholars Francis-Noel and Mark Turner, and they call it classic style. In classic style, the model is that prose is a window onto the world. The writer has seen something in the world which the reader has not yet noticed. He positions the reader so that she can see it with her own eyes. The reader and writer are equals. The goal is to help the reader see objective reality, and the style is conversation. Now, that might seem pretty obvious, but it is only one of a set of models of the communication scenario that can guide a writer. And Thomas and Turner differentiate classic style from a number of other styles including contemplative style, oracular style, and practical style. But the style that they claim that most academics write in, they call postmodern or self-conscious style, in which the writer's chief, if unstated, concern is to escape being convicted of philosophical naivete about his own enterprise. They continue, when we open a cookbook, we completely put aside and expect the author to put aside the kind of question that leads to the heart of certain philosophical traditions. Is it possible to talk about cooking? Do eggs really exist? Is food something about which knowledge is possible? Can anyone ever tell us anything true about cooking? Classic style similarly puts aside as inappropriate philosophical questions about its enterprise. If it took those questions up, it could never get around to treating its subject, and its purpose is exclusively to treat its subject. It would be a betrayal of the principles behind classic style if I just described what it was without giving you an example. And so here is an example. It's from an article in Newsweek by the physicist Brian Greene on the theory of inflationary cosmology and its implication, one of its implications, the multiverse. Greene writes, if space is now expanding, then at ever earlier times, the universe must have been ever smaller. At some moment in the distant past, everything we now see, the ingredients responsible for every planet, every star, every galaxy, even space itself, must have been compressed to an infinitesimal speck that then swelled outward, evolving into the universe as we know it. The Big Bang Theory was born. Yet scientists were aware that the Big Bang Theory suffered from a significant shortcoming. Of all things, it leaves out the bang. Einstein's equations do a wonderful job of describing how the universe evolved from a split second after the bang, but the equations break down, similar to the error message returned by a calculator when you try to divide 1 by 0, when applied to the extreme environment of the universe's earliest moment. The Big Bang thus provides no insight into what might have powered the bang itself. Now, in this passage, Greene goes over some fairly complex cosmology and physics, but he does it in a way that the reader can see for herself. If we accept that the universe is expanding, we can play the mental movie backwards and imagine the universe smaller and smaller as we go back further in time until it's an infinitesimal speck. And even the abstruse mathematical concept of equations breaking down, he describes in a way we can see for ourselves. We can either literally pull out a calculator and divide 1 by 0 and see that the screen will display an error message, or we can contemplate what it could possibly mean to divide the number 1 into 0 parts. Either way, we can appreciate the concept equations breaking down for ourselves. So that is classic style. I argue in the book that many examples of writing advice, old and new, are implications of the single model behind classic prose. Foremost, in classic prose, the focus is on the thing being shown, not the activity of studying it. And this is a hard lesson for academics to learn. I'll give you an example of the kind of paper introduction that I am forced to wade through daily from colleagues, from students, taken from my own field of language development. So here's a non-classic introduction to such a paper. In recent years, an increasing number of researchers have turned their attention to the problem of child language acquisition. In this article, recent theories of this process will be reviewed. Well, no offense, but not a whole lot of people are really interested in how professors spend their time. A classic introduction to the same topic could have been, all children acquire the ability to speak and understand a language without explicit lessons. How do they accomplish this feat? A corollary is to minimize the apologizing that many academic writers feel is mandatory. Again, a contrived example from my own field. The problem of language acquisition is extremely complex. It is difficult to give precise definitions of the concept of language and the concept of acquisition and the concept of children. There is much uncertainty about the interpretation of experimental data and a great deal of controversy surrounding the theories. More research needs to be done. Now, this is the kind of prose passage that can be deleted as a block with no loss of content. Because classic prose gives the reader credit for knowing that many concepts are hard to define and many controversies are hard to resolve. The reader is there to see what the writer is going to do about it. Another corollary is to minimize the kind of hedging that academics tend to drizzle over their sentences. The use of words like somewhat, fairly, rather, nearly, relatively, seemingly, in part, comparatively, predominantly, apparently, so to speak, and presumably. and the similar device of shutter quotes, by which a writer will distance himself from a common figure of speech. So this is a sentence taken from a letter of recommendation that I received, which illustrates this habit. She is a, quote, quick study and is able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her. Now, are we supposed to interpret this as saying that this young woman is a quick study, or that this young woman is a quick study, namely someone who is only alleged or rumored to be a quick study, but really isn't? And if she's been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her, are there some areas that interest her where she tried to educate herself but failed? This habit was brought home to me when I came across an old colleague at an academic conference. I asked how she was doing. She pulled out a picture of her 4-year-old daughter, and she said, "We virtually adore her." Why the compulsive hedging? Well, there is a saying in bureaucracies, abbreviated CYA, cover your anatomy. But there is an alternative in classic style, so sue me. That is, it is better to be clear and possibly wrong than muddy and, as the physicists say, not even wrong. Also, classic prose counts on the conventions of ordinary conversation. We could never have a chat unless we interpreted our conversational partner's sentences charitably in context. So if someone were to say, in recent years Americans have been getting fatter, you don't hold them to the claim that every last one of the 319 million citizens of the United States have all been getting fatter. In context, you interpret it to mean on average or all things being equal. A second major body of advice that falls out of the metaphor of classic prose is that it keeps up the illusion that the reader is seeing a world rather than just listening to verbiage. And that is an illusion that can be shattered when a writer depends too much on clichés. Hence the traditional gem of writing advice: avoid clichés like the plague. We are all too familiar with the kind of writer who dispenses prose such as the following. We needed to think outside the box in our search for the Holy Grail, but found that it was neither a magic bullet nor a slam dunk. So we rolled with the punches and let the chips fall where they may while seeing the glass is half full. It's a no-brainer. The problem with writing in clichés that the writer either forces the reader to turn off her visual brain and just process the verbiage as blah, 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 or if she actually does pay attention to the content of the words, she'll inevitably be upended by the ludicrous imagery, because a writer in clichés will inevitably mix his metaphors. As in this sentence, also taken from a letter of recommendation, Jeff is a Renaissance man, drilling down to the core issues and pushing the envelope. Or this sentence, this was someone quoted from the New York Times, an interview subject, not a writer, I hasten to add. No one has yet invented a condom that will knock people's socks off. And such writers will also be eligible for membership in AWFUL, Americans who figuratively use literally. Now, it is perfectly fine to say she literally blushed. It's not so good to say she literally exploded. And it's very, very bad to say she literally emasculated him. Now, classic prose is about the world. It's not about the conceptual tools with which we understand the world. And as such, it avoids overuse of metaconcepts, that is, concepts about concepts, such as approach, assumption, concept, condition, context, framework, issue, level, model, paradigm, perspective, process, role, strategy, tendency, and variable. That many, particularly academic writers, use in order to say anything about anything else. An example, this is from an op-ed by a legal scholar. I have serious doubts that trying to amend the Constitution would work on an actual level. On the aspirational level, however, a constitutional amendment strategy may be more valuable, which could be far more directly couched as, I doubt that trying to amend the Constitution would actually succeed, but it may be valuable to aspire to it. Or this, also taken from an email. It is important to approach this subject from a variety of strategies, including mental health assistance, but also from a law enforcement perspective. That is to say, we should consult a psychiatrist about this man, but we may also have to inform the police. Classic prose narrates ongoing events. We see agents performing actions that affect objects. Non-classic prose thingifies events and then refers to the thing using a dangerous tool of English grammar called nominalization, making something into a noun. So instead of appearing, you make an appearance. Instead of organizing something, you bring about the organization of that thing. The literary scholar Helen Sword calls them zombie nouns because they kind of lumber across the scene with no conscious agent actually directing their motions. An example, participants read assertions whose veracity was either affirmed or denied by the subsequent presentation of an assessment word. Translation, the people saw sentences each followed by the word true or false. Subjects were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation. To wit, we tested the students in a quiet room. But it's not just academics who write in zombie prose and speak, it's also politicians. When the Republican National Convention was threatened by a hurricane a couple of years ago, Texas Governor Rick Perry said, right now there is not any anticipation, there will be a cancellation. That is, right now we don't anticipate that we will have to cancel it. And just to be nonpartisan, here we have the Democratic Secretary of State John Kerry, who last spring during the Mideast peace negotiations said, the president is desirous of trying to see how we can make our best efforts in order to find a way to facilitate, that is to say, the president wants to help. And corporate consultants. In an interview with a young man, he was asked to explain what he did for a living, and he said, I'm a digital and social media strategist. I deliver programs, products, and strategies to our corporate clients across the spectrum of communications functions. And when the reporter pressed him on what that meant, he said, I teach big companies how to use Facebook. And product engineers. Portable generators used to carry the following warning sticker. Mild exposure to CO can result in accumulated damage over time. Extreme exposure to CO may rapidly be fatal without producing significant warning symptoms. Yeah, whatever. And as a result, every year, thousands of Americans asphyxiated themselves and their families by running portable generators indoors, until they replaced the sticker with this wording, using a generator indoors can kill you in minutes. So classic prose can literally be a matter of life and death. Literally. Okay, I'll mention one other point, which is to raise the question, why should this be so hard? Why is it so hard for writers to use language to convey ideas effectively? And my favorite explanation is a psychological phenomenon sometimes called the curse of knowledge. The fact that when you know something, it's hard to imagine what it's like for someone else not to know it. Psychologists have discovered it in many guises and given it a number of names, including mind blindness, egocentrism, and hindsight bias. The simplest explanation comes from an experiment familiar to anyone who's taken child psychology. A little boy comes into the lab, sits down at a table, is handed a box of M&Ms. He opens the box expecting to find candies, but instead he finds ribbons. The box has been tampered with. So he's surprised. The experimenter puts the ribbons back in the box, closes it, puts it back on the table, says, well, now Jeffrey's going to come into the room. What does he think is in the box? And the child says, ribbons. Now that they know that it has ribbons, they assume that everyone else does, even though, of course, another boy has no way of knowing what he knows, namely that the box has been tampered with. In fact, if you ask the boy, well, when you came into the room, what did you think was in the box? And the child will say, ribbons. Now that they know it, they can no longer recover the state at which they did not know it. Now, of course, we adults outgrow this fallacy, kinda, a little, sorta, because many experiments have shown that adults, too, will tend to project their knowledge to others. If a student knows an unusual word, they assume that everyone else knows it. If they know a obscure fact, they will often assume it's common knowledge. And one study shows that the more experience someone has using a gadget, such as a smartphone, the less time they estimate it will take a novice to learn how to use it. It's just so obvious. I think the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque writing. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that the readers haven't learned their jargon, don't know the intermediate steps in an argument that seem too obvious to mention, can't visualize a scene that's currently in the writer's mind's eye. And so the writer doesn't bother to explain the jargon or spell out the logic or supply the concrete details, even when writing for professional peers. I'll give you an example. This comes from a journal called Trends in Cognitive Science, explicitly designed to keep cognitive scientists abreast of developments in their own fields. Scientists sum up their research in an accessible way. This comes from an article on the science of consciousness. The slow and integrative nature of conscious perception is confirmed behaviorally by observations such as the rabbit illusion and its variants, where the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived is influenced by post-stimulus events arising several hundreds of milliseconds after the original stimulus. Now, I've been in this business for more than 3 decades, and I have no idea what they're talking about. For one thing, even though I teach illusions, I study illusions, I had never heard of the rabbit illusion. And I know what the word stimulus means, but I have no idea what they're talking about when they refer to a stimulus, nor the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived. So I went to my bookshelves. I found one that talked about a cutaneous rabbit illusion that works as follows. The subject closes his eyes, sticks out his arm. The experimenter taps him 3 times on the wrist, 3 times on the elbow, 3 times on the shoulder, and the person feels it as a series of taps running up the length of his arm, kind of like a hopping rabbit, hence the rabbit illusion. Well, why didn't they just say that? There is nothing that is more scientific about the word stimulus than the phrase a tap on the wrist. And there's nothing more scientific about the way a stimulus is ultimately perceived than it feels like a set of taps running up the length of your arm. In fact, not only is it not more scientific, it's less scientific. Because knowing concretely what the rabbit illusion consists of, I can follow the logic. The idea is that since your perception of the early taps depend on the later taps, that means that consciousness does not track events in real time, but the brain is always editing it after the fact to try to create the illusion of a coherent experience. Well, knowing that, I can now evaluate whether the rabbit illusion really does confirm the slow and integrative nature of conscious perception, or whether there is some alternative or simpler explanation, something that I as a scientist could not do with this more abstract, seemingly more scientific explanation. And I'll end with my favorite illustration of the hazards of thoughtless abbreviation and abstraction. It comes from an old joke. A man is vacationing at a Catskills resort. He goes into the dining room, and he sees a bunch of retired Borscht Belt comedians sitting around a table. And there's an empty seat. He joins them. And here's one of the men calling out, 37, and the others burst out into uproarious laughter. And another guy says, 42, and again, they're just gales of hilarious guffaws. He can't figure out what's going on. So he asks the guy next to him. He said, what's going on here? And the guy says, well, you know, these old-timers, they've been around each other for so long that they all know the same jokes. So to save time, they've given each one a number. And now they just have to recite the number. And the guy says, that's ingenious. Let me try it. So he calls out, 76. Stony silence. Tries again. 22. Everyone stares at him. No one laughs. So he sinks back down into a seat, and he asks the guy next to him, so what happened? What did I do wrong? The guy said, it's all in the way you tell it. How do you exercise the curse of knowledge? Well, the traditional way is traditional advice is always keep in mind the reader over your shoulder. That is, imagine your reader, try to get inside his skin, see the world from his point of view, walk a mile in his moccasins, feel his pain. Now that is good advice as far as it goes, but it doesn't really go far enough, because the problem is we're not very good at knowing what other people know, even when we force ourselves to try really, really hard. None of us has clairvoyance. A better bit of advice is to actually get a real reader and show them a draft and see if they can follow it. And you'll often be astonished to find that what's obvious to you isn't obvious to anyone else. Or you can wait enough time until enough time has elapsed that it is no longer familiar and show a draft to yourself. And if you're like me, you'll find yourself saying, what did I mean by that? Or that doesn't make any sense. Or all too often, who wrote this crap? And then rewrite several times with a single goal, simply recrafting the prose to make it more understandable to the reader. So to sum up, I've suggested in the book and given you a taste this evening of some ways in which modern linguistics and cognitive science can provide better ways of enhancing our writing. In particular, a model of prose communication, namely classic style, in which language is a window on the world, and a diagnosis of why good prose is so hard to write, namely the curse of knowledge. Thanks very much.
Well, you all deserve extra points for intrepidness because of coming out in that terrible weather. But I'm sure after hearing Steve's provocative and very delightful presentation that you're happy that you did, despite wet coats and wet feet. And I apologize for these beautiful sneakers, but the nice shoes I had on were completely flooded on the way over here. So sneakers it is.
Wet hair.
Yeah, right, wet hair too. You know, I tend to, I guess, remain very optimistic about the quality of writing and the longevity of good style because, you know, I can only reflect upon my own experiences, which I'll share a little bit more about myself with you. I professionally, as a journalist, have spent most of my career at the Wall Street Journal and then at the New York Times, where at both places I was a reporter and writer, but also a senior editor. And both of those news reports, because they're now mainly read in digital form, so to call either of them newspapers is probably old-fashioned. They're both news reports that prize clarity of writing, elegance of style. They both honor the intelligence of their readers without committing the sin of discursive thinking or writing, where the assumption is still that many readers will not have a high degree of technical knowledge about the subject that journalists either at a news organization like the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, you know, will not assume a high degree of technical knowledge, but also will be careful in the writing not to talk down to readers in any way. And I think the word that Steve used in his talk, and he repeated a couple of times, he said clearness, clarity, that is something that is highly prized in the reporting and writing at both the Journal and the New York Times. And my favorite saying of my boss at the Wall Street Journal, I worked for 10 years in the Washington Bureau, Washington, D.C. News Bureau of the Wall Street Journal, and my boss there was an editor named Al Hunt. And sometimes he would get very frustrated. He'd be reading the draft of a long story, and he would occasionally summon even me into his office, and he would look at me very piercingly, and he would say, "I don't want you to build me a clock. Just tell me what time it is." And you know, it's a saying that I always carried with me then when I became the boss, because that sort of just basic clarity is so important. And jargon of all kinds, and Steve walked you through all of the worst kinds. Bureaucratese, that John Kerry sentence is just so painful, but bureaucratese, and you know, he's you know, an Ivy League grad, he should know better. Bureaucratese, consultanese, oh God, consultants, you know, what they do to mangle our language and the sins they commit against clear writing. I could go on for hours. Let me just say that I never want to liaise with a consultant again in my life. And then there's, of course, legalese, which we haven't really had time to get into, but maybe the worst of all. Shakespeare, of course, was right, first kill all the lawyers, because what they do to our language is often a terrible thing.
And said second, kill all the grammarians.
Right, that's true
did,
too.
that's true.
But the thing that the consultants and the bureaucrats and the lawyers all have in common is, a desire to obfuscate, I would say, and muddy up thinking that is actually simple. They want to make things more complex than they are, and their convoluted style, which is often an obfuscation, I think, is in service of that end, which is regrettable. It's leached, into many other corners of writing. But when I said I remain an optimist, I do, in part, I think, because professionally I've spent so much of my career at places that prize clear and elegant writing and intelligent and thorough reporting. And also I've taught writing to undergraduates at Princeton, Yale, and now Harvard. And I have to say that I'm very impressed with the quality of undergraduate writing in all of those places. Sure, I cross out a fair number of clichés, and you had some great examples of those. But for the most part, I think that students, especially when they reach their junior or senior year, which is, I teach a seminar, and all of the courses I taught at Princeton and Yale too were small seminars, and mainly for upperclassmen, that many of the bad habits of academic writing have somehow been leached out of their systems by other teachers here at Harvard. I hope that that's true. As in terms of the role of journalists and journalism, journalists in many ways are the crucial interlocutors between experience and technical knowledge on the one hand, and readers and how knowledge is absorbed by readers on the other hand. And I think a key, and Steve, in what he was saying in his talk, I think hit on this, but I want to be more explicit about it, which is really great journalism shows and doesn't tell. It uses reported examples to support authoritative statements. And bad journalism often tells and repeats ad nauseum the point of an article and doesn't show with vivid examples. And if I did anything as an editor at either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, it was constantly saying to the writers and reporters who work for me, show, don't tell. And I should emphasize that, my work was on the news pages, not in opinion land. So what I'm saying applies less to editorial writing and the opinion side of those publications, although I think the best opinion writers, whether it is a stylist like Maureen Dowd at the New York Times, or Paul Gigot, who is a conservative voice at the Wall Street Journal, that their most persuasive opinion writing is often so vivid because they use reported example to support their arguments. So here we have landed in the digital world, where most people are reading on a device rather than on the printed page. And here is what I worry about. I think there's plenty of great writing, so I don't want to seem like I'm a Cassandra about the digital age at all. But in journalism, I worry about two trends that almost are opposite, are almost opposites. One, Steve mentioned, the Twitter effect, which is everything should be short and pithy, and complex ideas need to be communicated in very few characters. That's one trend. I worry less about that trend and more about the fact that in terms of digital publishing, there is no finite endpoint. A printed newspaper had not only a time, a certain time deadline per day. At the New York Times, at the point I first came to work there, the drop-dead deadline was always at 9 o'clock at night for the next day's paper. Now deadlines are 24/7, but you were also, besides having a time deadline, you always had a word deadline. By and large, articles in the New York Times were between 900 and 1,200 words was a long story in the days of newsprint. Newsprint is very expensive. The news whole of the print New York Times is a finite thing. It cannot, the number of pages in the print newspaper doesn't vary much day to day, except on Sundays, obviously, when you have many sections. But, in terms of digital publishing, articles can go on and on. And I worry that in much of what I read online, there is tedious repetition and needless verbiage. And that worries me a lot. Luckily, again, at places like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, their newsrooms are well resourced enough that there are editors who go through every article at some point with the metaphorical editing blade to get rid of that repetition. But I think jargon writing creeps into very fast reportage. If I have to read the phrase, the stakes are high, or the stakes are enormously high, even worse about that. Basically, that sentence appears in just about every article about a piece of legislation that's about to be voted on. And I called that Robowriting, and that's what I called it when I was executive editor at the Times. And it's kind of a reflexive set of words that, if you imagine an automatic save get key, there are certain phrases like that that I think as like save get writing. It does not honor the intelligence of readers. And we could spend the whole rest of this day and go on for weeks talking about whether technology has had a good effect on writing or a bad effect. Something that I worried about at the Times, I remember I was assigned to lead a panel discussion about a book that the Times published, which was all of the journalism that the Times published over the 4 days from President Kennedy's assassination on Friday, November 22nd, to his funeral the following Monday. It was lots of articles, but the major impression that rereading all of those articles made on me is that that event, the assassination of Kennedy, became the moment where big news primarily was experienced by the country on television. Everyone gathered at their TV sets and watched, his body lying in state, his widow walking behind the funeral cortege. But the interesting thing about the copy that I was reading is that in real time, I don't think the Times writers of that period, who included Pulitzer Prize winners like Anthony Lewis and James Riston, I don't think in real time they got that. So that their writing was so descriptive and vivid. I remember, a piece that Tony Lewis wrote where he almost described every step that Mrs. Kennedy took as she approached the president's coffin the first time. And what I don't think he realized as he wrote that piece is that America was watching it on TV, but his article was fantastic. The descriptions were riveting to me, but what I realized is that we've lived in an era where television, came to the fore, even, with more ferocity, but that out of journalistic writing, that bled a certain amount of descriptive writing. And that makes me sad. I brought with me, I just took this off of my office bookshelf, a great 20th century journalist who wrote in the pre-television age was A.J. Liebling. He just is incredibly funny, incredibly descriptive and gifted, but the style in which he writes, it's kind of vanished from the scene, which does make me sad. And in my class, which is called Introduction to Journalism, the first thing that I have the students read isn't journalism. It's a short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I didn't have the book the short story I have them read is called Winter Dreams, but this is a pretty great one too. This is a novella of his called The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, and Fitzgerald just writes back to clarity with such economy and clarity. And he is writing at a different hinge moment, not the Kennedy moment, which was the shift from print journalism to TV image. But Fitzgerald was writing at a hinge moment in our history before movies. And when you read him now, I see pictures in my head, and I love that. But once the movies came into existence, I think writers stopped writing that way. Not completely. The best novelists still paint amazing pictures in our heads. But I think it's important in teaching writing here, and even teaching my course is the first course Harvard has ever had with journalism in the title, but whether I'm teaching journalism or the preferable euphemism is apparently nonfiction narrative. Have it either way, but I think it is important to go back and read some of the classics, because like Steve, I believe there is a classic style. I think over time it's changed, but that its enduring and essential quality is clarity.
Well, I'm going to ask one question and then we'll open it up to the audience. So in a recent op-ed in the Crimson, Milo Beckman, who was a senior in the college and may be here, wrote that Academics put out lousy writing because they went through 20 years of schooling that rewarded lousy writing. So if we want to improve writing and writing instruction, do we need to reconsider how we grade writing? Or, more generally, to what extent is bad writing more than just an individual problem, but an institutional one as well?
Yeah. Yes, and I've corresponded with Milo Beckman, and the article was stimulating. And Jill also mentioned that a lot of bad writing comes from a desire to obfuscate. And I think some does, and I think that there are bad habits that can be rewarded. But my major diagnosis of why there's so much bad writing is not so much that it's a conscious desire to obfuscate, as in the cartoon that said good start needs more gibberish. Although this is not to deny that there are some academic fields in which that really is the reward structure. But Sam, you sent me an article just this morning or yesterday that actually showed that if you use gratuitous big words, people actually give a lower estimate to your competence and intelligence compared to the same prose expressed clearly and simply. So I think there's actually a misconception that if you use convoluted verbiage, unnecessary, low-frequency words, you'll impress your reader, whereas in fact the effect is often the other way around. And certainly in my academic field, in psychology, there's a lot of bad writing, but everyone agrees that when you're reading a grant proposal, when you're reviewing a manuscript, when you're reading something, it puts you in a bad mood when it is badly written. And no one wins points for bad writing, contrary to the idea that the gatekeepers of academia insist on turgid prose. And Helen Sword, who I mentioned as the coiner of the phrase zombie noun, actually did a study of scholarly articles in a book called Stylish Academic Writing. I know it sounds like one of the world's thinnest books, but she actually did a study, and she found that in every field that she surveyed, about 15% of the articles were, by any standard, well-written. And in our own field, Sam, in psychology, some of the most famous psychologists were gifted stylists. William James, B.F. Skinner, Roger Brown, George Miller, Gordon Allport.
You mentioned Charles Darwin.
Charles Darwin,
fabulous
another
stylist.
fabulous writer. Yeah, and I think there's a reason why it's paradoxically often scientists who hone the craft of writing, of good writing, and by many estimations, the worst academic writers are in departments of English. But we can. I actually have a theory as to why that might be true, but I'll set that aside. I think the reason that there's a misconception, I think, that academia insists on or rewards bad writing, and I think there are other explanations. One of them is I noticed that I agree with you, Jill, that Harvard and Yale undergraduates are, by and large, pretty good writers. Harvard and Yale graduate students, not so much. And I noticed a sudden decline in writing quality when a typical student writes their first graduate school term paper, or paper, I should say. And I think there's a reason for it, and it points back to Thomas and Turner's characterization of what the writer thinks their goal is in writing. And the thing is that when you're an undergraduate, your goal in writing is to explain something. When you're a graduate student, your goal in writing is to prove that you're worthy of entrance into this guild or clique. And so the writing becomes much more self-conscious. It makes much more use of metaconcepts to show that you're not a naive realist who thinks that you can just know something by looking at it, that you can tell just by showing, but rather you're acutely aware of the theoretical constructs that your field uses in order to study something, and you must be acutely conscious of the tentativeness. Is that a little bit
because graduate students tend to feel obliged to write in an authoritatively, and that's telling more than showing?
I think it's actually it may even be the opposite, that they are supposed to be, they're acutely aware that you can't, that acquiring knowledge is difficult, and that you get dinged, you lose points if you make a claim without it being both properly sourced and justified and expressed with the appropriate degree of tentativeness. That is, we are always in the process of adding to the world's storehouse of knowledge.
That makes sense.
And the transition back from academies to more accessible writing often consists of that so sue me attitude, where you deliberately cut away a lot of the qualifications that you make when you're defending yourself against your peers, putting yourself out there and saying, this is my best estimate of what I see and what you can see as well. And it's interesting that the show, don't tell imperative, which is also used in creative writing classes, is almost a succinct definition of classic style, namely that the model is something like vision and the writer's role is pretending to show. Now, of course, it all is words. You're not literally showing, and I think that those Jill's observations about the writing with or without the availability of actual imagery in the form of the movies and television and photography and click-through slideshows is very, very interesting, because a writer that can't rely on the readers having access to a photograph really does have to think about the visual, which may be why it reminded me of how sports fans will often notice that it's the radio announcers that are much more colorful and vivid and stylish than the TV announcers. Those of you who remember Johnny Most in Boston.
Can I ask for a show of hands how many of you are addicted to cereal? Because, yeah, that is, I mean, Sarah Koenig isn't a sports announcer, but it's an example of the power of storytelling through your ears. And I think she is a skilled narrative stylist. But there's something that makes it extra narcotic because you're listening to it.
Yeah, Thanksgiving was very disappointing for me because there wasn't the next installment of Serial.
Although it was worth the wait, number 10, worth the wait.
Well, and Legalese involves yet another dimension of writing. And you can often learn a lot about good writing by trying to figure out what makes bad writing bad, as in the self-conscious defensiveness versus showing something that's out there. But the other one is that I mentioned briefly that ordinary conversation requires a lot of cooperativeness. You literally have to be on speaking terms, and you and the conversational partner have to have the same goal so that you can allow your partner to read between the lines, connect the dots, and you don't have to spell everything out tediously and laboriously. And psycholinguists know this as pragmatics or Gricean conversational postulates, all the common ground between speaker and hearer that just make ordinary conversation possible. Now, the thing about Legalese is your reader is not cooperative, your reader is adversarial. So your reader is actually going to exploit any little bit of ambiguity, any step that you've skipped to their advantage, to your disadvantage. And so there's at least one good reason why Legalese has to be bad prose. Although, having said that, people who've looked at Legalese have noted there's an awful lot there that actually does not add to legal precision, but really is superfluous.
Great. Well, if anyone has a question, raise your hand. We got microphones and people to find you.
Question for both of you, and thank you for doing this presentation, and Professor Pinker for your great intervention in a much crowded field, much needed intervention in that crowded field of bad advice for writers. I guess I'd like to hear about both of your experiences as developing writers when you were younger. So at what point did you see the writing that you were doing as a mark of strength, that you were developing a competence? As you look back now, what made for that development as competent writers? And the other question I have that's related to that is, it's clear that both of you believe that people can learn to write better, right, at different ages even. But is there a point past which it's unlikely? And I'm thinking about, there are those who think that you actually can't teach people to write well. It's too late at some point. If I don't know what that age might be past which the neuroplasticity of the brain is, it's just not working anymore. So both of those questions, please. Thanks.
I will answer your question personally. I think that I was an undergraduate here at Harvard, and that making a point in an authority voice, but immediately supporting it with examples was the ideal here. That was the best way to ace an exam, is have a clear answer to the question, but cite examples from the reading, from whatever the topic of the course was, in a high degree of specificity, and making it vivid and readable was something that somehow I learned here. And I think that those are the building blocks of good writing. I think, I don't know, I'm an optimist about people's ability to learn better writing, because I think that anyone, I mean, we all can collect evidence to back up a point, and that, you know, if someone's become a very convoluted or tangled writer, that sometimes it's as simple as saying, make your authority point, make it quickly and clear, don't go on and on. You know, I'm only going to let that be a tenth of your piece of writing. You know, the rest of it, the other 9 parts, have to be vivid examples that anyone can learn to do that. I'm not saying that ratio is the ideal, but something, you know, about F. Scott Fitzgerald's writing is that even in his short stories, that is his style. He makes statements as the author in an authority voice, and yet through the development of character and establishing narrative tension and telling a story, he backs up that point. Probably the most famous authority point being, the rich are different from you and me. Every single story is almost about that. But making a point and backing it up with vivid, specific examples is a good route back, anyway, to clarity and good writing, I think.
For me, certainly, having models that I wanted to emulate was a big part of my motivation in improving my writing. When I saw the writing of people like George Miller and Roger Brown and B.F. Skinner in my own field, perhaps these models made me aware that clear, vivid writing is not an impediment to academic success. And also I would, and this is a habit that I recommend in the first chapter is the starting point of becoming a good writer, and that is you've got to enjoy good writing in others. You've got to stop, when you read a sentence that strikes you as pleasurable, enjoyable, clear, just linger and try to reverse engineer it. What makes it so good? And that's a habit I got into quite early. And I just remember George Miller, who taught at Harvard before I got here, but in explaining his own scientific autobiography of why he began his own research in language by being hired during World War II at the psychoacoustic lab here at Harvard under a defense contract. He said, wars are noisy, armies must communicate. So that's 6 words that I could just imagine taking like 40, 50, 60 words to express that same thought, but he did it concretely. You know, wars are noisy. In a way, just realized so much is packed into that, and it's showing, not telling. And I can think of a lot of other examples like that I read as an undergraduate. I think psychology, including psychology of language, was a good source, and analytic philosophy was also an inspiration. There are a lot of very pithy, a tradition of pithy, witty writers in analytic philosophy: Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, Gilbert Ryle, W.V.O. Quine, Nelson Goodman, and taking those courses, you know, that inspired me.
Hearing you mention Professor Quine, I can't, since you told your Borscht Belt joke, I can't resist sharing with the audience. There were a favorite practical joke when I was an undergraduate among my husband, who was a classmate of mine, was a philosophy major. I'm not saying that he placed one of these phone calls, but was to call up Professor Kwan and say to him, preferably at around 10 o'clock at night, so like when any normal person is getting a little sleepy, and they would say, Professor Kwan, what is the difference between word and object? And he would fall for it every time and go into a long discourse about that.
That's very good.
So we're at time. If you have to go, go. If you can stay, let's take a few more questions.
When someone says they literally died, we rarely misinterpret that sentence, right? So I'm actually curious why that we have this recent bugaboo about using the word literally, figuratively. It would be odd to say I figuratively died. We don't use words literally that way, and like figuratively. And I think it's more an issue of I mean, we use lots of words in that position. We could say that things are totally, completely, that aren't totally and completely. Those don't seem to be as charged. And it's become kind of a shibboleth, like using hopefully as a sentential modifier, that if you're a smart person, you don't do that.
Yeah.
So I think it actually has, it's something to do with register and this creep that we always have from a more casual register to a more formal register, and literally is making that jump. So I'm wondering, in general, do you think that there has been creep from casual to formal register? And it seems to me that there has. And do we think that's a bad thing?
Yeah. No, I think that those are all insightful observations, and I have a whole discussion of literally in the book, which notes that, as you say, in context, literally is really not confusing. And it's not it is not a heinous error. It is an example of hyperbole, and there are many other examples. In fact, most of our superlatives can't be taken literally, like the fantastic, worthy of fantasy, awesome, inspiring awe, terrific, inspiring terror. There is this process of superlative inflation, where speakers are constantly trying to impress each other as to how out of the ordinary a particular experience that they're recounting is, and you soon run out of adjectives that haven't been bleached of all meaning, and that happens to literally. So I agree with you, it's not, in context, it's not confusing. I even reproduce an XKCD cartoon where a purist is visited by a ghost, a linguistic purist, and the ghost says, I bring you a vision of things to come. This is the future. And you see, a couple walk in front of a house, and birds in the tree, and sunshine. And the next panel is, and this is the future if you give up the fight over literally. And it's the same panel of the birds and the trees and the sun shining, and so on. So yes, it can be overused as a sign of the inherent decline of language. And so what I do is I say that this is not a heinous error, it's completely understandable in context. But if you're striving for a kind of classic style, that is, if you want your words to be appreciated, enjoyed by your readers, if you want to give it that extra sparkle, then treat the visual, sensory, show, don't tell imperative seriously. And if you do that, then using literally to mean literally and not using it to mean figuratively gives your prose that extra little bit of precision, sparkle, pleasure, and so on. And I distinguish clearly between affronts against logic and grammar, which literally is not, as you point out, and just pointers to style that make your prose a little bit more enjoyable.
Question? Someone?
Thank you for speaking with us. I'm wondering where figurative language fits into your idea of clarity, because when I write, I want to be completely clear, but I think my moments of greatest revelation are when I put two things together that, as I say to students, maybe have never been considered together before on the planet. And I think that's, and I think if people think about that as writers, they think, hey, I can put something together that's never been put together ever. And I think that gives them great power, or the capability of great power. So I'm wondering how figurative language can fit into this idea of clarity. Because I think it almost goes beyond clarity if it's awesome. Sorry.
I think it's a good question. In fact, I was going to pose a question to Jill that's related to this. So clarity is, I think, the great imperative in writing. And classic style valorizes clarity. But Thomas and Turner point out that there's another style that overlaps classic style that's not exactly the same, which they call plain style. Plain style only valorizes clarity. Classic style often has a little bit extra. There are surprises to the reader. It forces the reader to think. It forces the reader to wonder why a writer is using a particular figure of speech. And it's, as Thomas and Turner put it, it's aristocratic, not egalitarian. The reader sometimes may have to work hard in classic style to figure out what the reader is pointing to. It may be subtle, but the reader's effort will be rewarded because the writer will put the reader give them a vantage point where they have an unobstructed view. Even if they have to work very hard to see it, the effort will be rewarded. And so the extra, the turns of phrase, the striking figures of speech are...
Well, you're also talking about originality of thought.
and expression, I think. And I was, this was going to lead to my question to Jill, but an example would be, I cite in some of the examples of good prose in the book, the 4 obituaries from the New York Times. Now, obituaries are not typically a place where you expect witty, sparkling writing. But at least many of the obituary writers, I single out Marguerite Fox.
She's fantastic.
And she's fantastic.
Yeah.
They are they're irreverent, they're funny, while being respectful. So she, for example, her obituary for Helen Gurley Brown, the founder of Cosmopolitan magazine, in the part of the obituary that has to indicate when the person passed away, said she was 90, but parts of her were much younger. Now, that's something you don't expect to see in obituary. That is not plain style. That would be classic. You have to think for a while. But what makes it doubly appropriate is that the subject of the obituary, Helen Gurley Brown, was a champion of women's self-expression, their use of attractiveness to advance their interests. So said of her, it has another twist that she herself would have enjoyed the joke. So that's the kind of thing that's not plain, but that would be classic. And so I guess my question is, how much conscious awareness, encouragement, policy at the Times tries to encourage the leap from just clarity in plain style to that extra little bit of wit and sparkle in classic style?
Well, I think in parts of the news report and obituaries at the Times, going back to a very famous obituary writer at the Times was Alden Whitman, and Gay Talese, who is one of the most stylish profile writers in journalism, did a very famous and wonderful profile of him, which anyone would have a great time reading. Is one place in the news report or newspaper where a kind of surprising, delightful style is as prized as the ability to convey information, the who, what, classic who, what, when, where of a story. So, I mean, the wonderful thing about the New York Times is I think of it as an intellectual buffet table where the reader is exposed to many different styles and ways of conveying information, but where figurative language can become problematic in journalism is that, the enemy of any journalist's writing is just the reader at any point can just stop reading, can become confused. You don't want a reader to ever feel in a piece of journalism, where am I? I'm lost. Like, good journalism literally takes the reader by the hand and in a helpful way takes him or her on a walk of revelation. But reader can decide he or she is lost or confused, or that the idea is just a bit too complex, that they don't want to go on the journey anymore and they're going to move on to somebody else's piece. And so that's what the writer is combating, and how he or she presents, both in style and in content, a particular piece of journalism.
Well, I think we better wrap it up. Let me thank Greg Harris, Tom Jen, Sarah Shaughnessy, Brooke Pulitzer, Aaron Driverlin, Peter Bowl, Steve, Jill, and all of you. Thank you.